Hi everybody. In this series of talks with the Peace and Reconciliation Network, we've been trying to figure out how as churches we can minister to the people around us who've experienced horrible atrocities and traumas. It's a daunting task really when you think about it, and a short series of talks and maybe discussions that happen between the talks. It's only the beginning. And so please, as you watch this video, just think about some of the questions and some of the ideas that come to mind, and notice what's going on for you. We're not going to be able to solve these things in this very, very limited video, but we can at least raise some of these ideas and start thinking about them, and start thinking about the ways that our churches can foster these various aspects of community that will actually go a long way in helping these people in our communities to recover from their traumas. So today's topic that I wanted to talk to you about is this idea of empathy. To me, it's kind of like listening part 2. In the previous talk, I talked about listening and how important it is. But empathy really is listening in a way, but it goes further than that. So it builds on the listening topic. So one way of looking at it, and maybe a question we can ask ourselves is, how do we feel the pain of others in our midst? How can we show our suffering brothers and sisters that we understand them on some level? And how can we translate this empathy into action? I tell you, when I think about this topic, I can't help but think of the verse that's notoriously the shortest verse in the Bible, the verse of Jesus wept. It's very interesting that this was shared in the Bible. Now, of course, you remember the context likely that Jesus had just learned that Lazarus had died, and he wept over the fact that Lazarus had died. Now, this is really interesting for a bunch of different reasons. Not only does it express to us the depth of the emotion that Jesus had, his love and his mourning for Lazarus, which in and of itself is a wonderful example of how to respond in a traumatic sort of encounter with people in our loved ones and people in our midst, right? Like he ticked off the boxes of lament and listening and also feeling that empathy too, which is what we're talking about now. But the interesting thing about this is that he knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. At least that's the way that I understand it. I think that even when he was weeping, he knew that he was still going to raise Lazarus from the dead. So wasn't that super interesting? Like, how do we reconcile this? So even though he knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, he allowed himself to join into the mourning of the sisters and the community. Right? Lazarus' sisters and the whole community that was mourning the death of Lazarus. He entered into that mourning with them. He felt those same feelings. He expressed those same feelings with them in a way that was so recognizable that it was portrayed and written about in the scripture. So what can we learn from this? How does this apply to our topic today about trauma? Well, Jesus didn't minimize the sisters' grief, but he acknowledged it and he embodied it, and he mourned along with them. It's a step beyond listening. It's an entering in on some level to the mourning and validating it powerfully. Now, I know this sounds a lot like the talk on lament that I've already shared with you. And in some ways, it is very similar. But in this case, it's not just about creating a space for people to lament and for people to kind of cry out to God. But it's also listening to the point where we're truly understanding what someone is sharing and even entering into that with them, if it's possible. Now, I know that it's kind of impossible for us to really feel what people are feeling. Like, I have clients from all over the world, again, people who've experienced war zones, and they've had experiences that I'll never understand, at least not the way my life has gone, right? Like, they've had totally different experiences than what I've had. I haven't felt the things that they've felt. But as I listen to them and as I create that space with them, and begin to relate to them as people. I know that sounds strange, but just think about it. You relate to them as people, you start to realize that what they're sharing is not unimaginable. Like you can feel it as they talk. And so I enter in with them to a certain extent. Acknowledge their humanity and mourn with them. And I'm saying that this is the kind of thing that we in our church communities can do. For those who've suffered incredible atrocities, we can pause to feel their grief and mourning with them, even as we're about to help them. And that's how we can tie in that piece of Jesus. We knew that Jesus knew that he was going to heal Lazarus. He knew he was going to help the sisters to feel better. He knew the community would rejoice after Lazarus walked out of that grave, right? Yet he mourned with them first. And so even as we're ministering with the people that we're trying to reach out to, even as we know that we have the ultimate answer in holding up Christ for them, we can still enter into that mourning as a first step while we are ministering that healing. Now, this idea of empathy, it involves seeing people as people. We can often let our stereotypes of people, of different people, prevent us from putting ourselves into their shoes, so to speak. But if we build a relationship with people different than us, we can see who they are and share Christ's love with them. So a big part of empathy, I think, is about putting aside those stereotypes and truly listening to people. I've had clients who are different age than me, older clients than me. This is a really interesting thing to kind of admit to you, but people who are much older, and then you listen to them, and you listen to them carefully, maybe in a way that I wouldn't listen to people in my daily life, to be frank with you, or in a way that I've just, been brought up to listen to people. And I come to realize that, wow, they have the same fears and anxieties that I do. They have the same goals that I do, even as someone much, much older. They are people. And this big difference that I kind of imagined in my mind of age really kind of melted away, and you realize, no, they're just someone like me. They have a lot of the same views and beliefs and goals that I do. And the same thing can be said for all the various people across the different cultures that are also walking amongst us in our neighborhoods that we're endeavoring to reach out to. So this involves seeing people as people, which again, it might be kind of a strange thing, but this is really important. This is one way that a client put it towards me. They said to me that empathy isn't necessarily feeling what other people feel, but communicating to them that they are heard and understood. And in order to do that, you have to kind of acknowledge that we share a lot of the same pieces in our humanity. So even though there are some profound cultural differences that might exist, if you put yourself in their shoes, you can understand, wait a second. This is a person like me, and they might benefit from something that I would want. So look at it this way. You have someone who's been oppressed in their country for being a certain ethnic group. And maybe there's a war where they lost loved ones and they themselves saw horrific things. And through a long process, maybe of suffering, living in a refugee camp maybe at some point, they end up finding themselves coming to Canada, being placed in a nice home, in a climate that might be really different than what you're used to. And they're here. And they might have, their family might be fractured, but they might have a family member or two with them, or they might be by themselves. And now they're asked to kind of pick up and live and try to figure out life. And you can't read the language, and you don't know anybody, and you don't have any really very much money, like you just can't buy your way through this thing. So think about that for a moment. What would you want? What kind of help would you want in that moment? Can you enter into that experience and be like, wait a second, that would be really, really hard. Like I can feel that. And even though I don't fully feel it because I'm an established person here in Canada, etc., I can understand and I can get where people are coming from. I can understand why this would be something that would be traumatic. And so then you would then respond in the way that you would hope to be responded to. Right? If you think about it, you would say, if I was that person, I'd want people around me to come and try to help me. I'd want people to explain to me how Canada works. I want people to cry with me when I think about my loved ones who I've lost. I want people to help me with just the daily things in life. I want people to embrace me in a community of faith. I want people to help my child to deal with this too, and to help them to feel like they're going to be okay in this new country, in this new place. I want friends to spend time with and to laugh with. I want people to share with me what Canada is all about. And maybe even more importantly, well, definitely more importantly, I want people to share with me what the importance of church and God is in this country, and how he still speaks and how he's still the same even here. Empathy is kind of the piece that brings all of that out by helping people by understanding where people are coming from and by embracing that. I have a quote from Henri Nouwen that I want to read. And he writes, "Compassion," and I'm kind of equating this with empathy because to me it sounds like the same thing, at least the way that I'm defining empathy here. Compassion asks us to go where it hurts, to enter into places of pain, to share in brokenness, fear, confusion, and anguish. Compassion challenges us to cry out with those in misery, to mourn with those who are lonely, to weep with those in tears. Compassion requires us to be weak with the weak, vulnerable with the vulnerable, and powerless with the powerless. Compassion means full immersion in the condition of being human. So again, this is the call that I think is being placed in our Christian communities. Do we have the sense, do we have the empathy and the space in our hearts and in our current structures to open up, to go there with people in this way, to be vulnerable with people, to walk with them, to truly walk along with them? Again, this is just one aspect of trauma healing, right? One aspect of reconciliation. But I don't think you can do the other stuff, maybe the more technical stuff or the more clinical stuff, or, I don't think you can really do that without this idea of empathy, of putting yourself in the shoes of the foreigner who's walking around in our neighborhood, lonely, dejected, hurting, scared, confused. How do we put ourselves into the shoes of someone like that so that we can minister God's love to them? What would we want from our church, our local church, or churches or Christians, or, if we were put into the same situation? How would we want to be treated? Really a fundamental principle, really, right? Nothing really that earth-shattering, really. You're probably wondering, why did I just sit through this video to listen to this thing that I kind of already knew? But I'm telling you, from my privileged position as a trauma therapist and as someone who's had the chance to talk to people from around the world and around the world itself too, that one thing that they really would love to have is someone to be empathetic to them. And they've had experiences where that hasn't happened, and they're longing and waiting for that. And so this call again takes time, takes commitment, takes some cost. It might even be draining to a certain extent. I imagine after Jesus wept that he didn't really feel physically that good, right? There's a cost to this. But in the end, that was what set up his healing in that situation with Lazarus. And I believe that kind of relationship, that kind of empathy, is what he's calling us to, so that as we suffer with people and truly connect with them on this level, that our churches can be a source of healing for them. God bless you.